Thank you for being here. So many wonderful faces, and some people that I got to meet in person for the first time. So I'm Karen Phillips, and it's a very special honor to introduce tonight's Ottaway Ceremony honoring Marcia Lynx Qualey as one of my last official duties as Executive Director and Publisher at Words Without Borders. The Ottaway Award for the Promotion of International Literature was awarded for the first time in 2013, incidentally also my first year at Words Without Borders. And it went to the pioneering editor, Dranka Willen, who published so many Nobel laureates that people would joke that she should have a pied-à-terre in Stockholm. The Words Without Borders board established this award as a way to recognize individuals who devoted their careers to championing literature from around the world, bringing necessary writing to readers of English, and then through English into a much wider conversation. The award bears the name of the organization's first board chair, Jim Ottaway Jr., who, in his thoughtful, strategic, and behind-the-scenes way, had ensured that Words Without Borders had the foundation to grow into the organization it has become today. In addition to Willen, Ottaway laureates to date include the late Carol Brown Janeway and Edith Grossman, Sarah Burstell, Jill Schoolman, Barbara Etler, Chad Post, Danny Hahn, and Naveen Kishore. Naveen Kishore of Seagull Books was not able to travel to New York from India to accept his award in 2021, but fortuitously finds himself here with us tonight. So I would like to just take a moment to recognize Naveen and to applaud his work. Over the years, I've come to think about the Ottaway Award less in terms of promotion and more in terms of the labor-intensive work of carving out a space that enables us as readers of English to listen to the brilliant, inspiring, humorous, soothing, outrageous, or even terrifying literary voices who engage their worlds through the art of writing. And in this radical act of listening beyond our linguistic limitations, that can lead to an expansion of consciousness and to our ability to reimagine the world. And while many rightly question the notion that our sense of humanity can somehow be enlarged and reshaped merely through reading, I continue to believe in that possibility. The work of this year's awardee, whom you'll learn more about shortly, reflects in many ways the evolution of the field of literary translation. Marcia is the first Ottaway awardee, known primarily for her founding and nurturing of a literary magazine and a translators collective. The first awardee to be focused primarily on the Arabic language, and the first awardee to be based in North Africa. Marcia and the programming under the ArabLit umbrella point us to where the sector is headed, with greater representation for languages that historically have been marginalized or even ignored, to an emphasis on collaboration and mentorship that span borders and bring more voices into the field, and to a solidarity between readers, writers, translators, and publishers that is so urgently needed today. I would now like to introduce Yasmine Seale, who will provide tonight's encomium. Yasmine's work includes poetry, translation, criticism, and printmaking. Her writing and translations have appeared in Harper's, The Nation, The Paris Review, Words Without Borders, and elsewhere. Her books include Agitated Air, Poems After Ibn Arabi, a collaboration with Robin Moder, and Something Evergreen Called Life, her translation of poems by Rania Mahmoud. Among her honors are the 2020 Wasafiri New Writing Prize for Poetry and fellowships from the Wolfson Foundation, Koç University in Istanbul, and the Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris. As a 2023-24 fellow at the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, she worked on producing a new translation of 1001 Nights. Please join me tonight in welcoming Yasmine Seale.
It's a true delight to be celebrating Marcia Lynx Qualey, to present her with the Ottaway Award for the promotion of international literature, and to have the opportunity to say a few words about Marcia and the vital work she does. For as long as there's been literature in Arabic, there have been poems of praise, known as madh. And on being asked to make these remarks today, I was half tempted to compose an ode to Marcia in that vein. I would have paid tribute, as is customary in such poems, to Marcia's generosity and valiance, as well as to her riding skills and her prowess in battle. I would have compared her to various evergreen desert plants. And of course, I would have praised our hosts and benefactors, and declared the staff of Words Without Borders to be more brilliant than the sun, since their splendor continues even at night. But Marcia, I know, is impatient with pomp and mistrustful of cant. I mean, the insincere use of language, not the philosopher, though perhaps you mistrust him too. So instead, I'll just try very simply to express what Marcia's work has meant to me and to countless others. Dear Marcia, we've yet to meet, at least at the time that I write this, but it's a sign of your generosity of spirit, your willingness to give of yourself, that I have always felt close to you. I began reading your blog, ArabLit, shortly after you founded it in 2009. I was at university at the time, studying Arabic, not yet knowing how central this language and literature would become in my life. Your blog was an education, a companion to what I encountered in the classroom, and also a corrective to it. I sometimes felt in college that I was being taught a dead language, that the antiquated translations I was reading had little to do with the Arabic texts that moved and excited me so much on the page, or indeed with the lively Arabic I heard and spoke at home. You stepped into that space between books and the people who make them. You showed those of us who loved what we read that we were not alone, that literature was also a living community and a conversation. By highlighting the work being done by publishers and translators, solitary and scattered as they were, you created a space into which others could step. I have always translated, but without ArabLit, I'm not sure I would have become a translator. You helped define what I was doing, and you believed in it before I did. It made all the difference that someone was paying attention. I've lost count of the number of people who've told me over the years that you gave them a crucial boost as they were starting out. It's been amazing to see ArabLit grow from a blog into a constellation of print, online, and audio projects. And I've had the pleasure of working with you several times. But it's our first encounter that comes back to me now. I first made contact with you in 2013, freshly graduated and keen to contribute a review. You wrote back straight away with what I now see as your distinctive blend of sweetness and saltiness, waving aside my overly formal approach and welcoming me in warmly but without further ceremony. I filed the piece a little late. Life, I explained, had gotten in the way. You understood, you said, since you had one of those pesky things yourself. Looking back at that first exchange, I realized that even then you were teaching me something. That language should not be used to obfuscate, that formality can get in the way of true connection, that work is not separate from life, but wonderfully and messily woven in with it. I recently heard the translator Jeffrey Zuckerman describe the act of translation as opening a door. I think this is what you do too, Marcia. You open doors, not just as a translator, but as a journalist, a reviewer, an advocate, an editor, a publisher, a podcaster, and a fiercely devoted champion of countless other writers and translators. At the London Book Fair in 2017, you were granted the Literary Translation Initiative Award for your, quote, your strong personal dedication to creating cross-cultural understanding in the diverse world of Arabic literature. You've been described as a one-woman powerhouse, and everyone who knows you cannot fail to be impressed by the remarkable energy and warmth and sense of purpose that drives you. And just so you don't have to only take my word from it, I'm going to read you a couple of testimonies from people who know you better than I do. Neriman Yusuf, the translator, says, "I've never met anyone who worked so tirelessly and consistently while always downplaying their own efforts and lauding others for the smallest contribution. I'm delighted that at last she's receiving some well-deserved recognition that she might just have to accept." And Ursula Lindsay, your co-host on the BULAQ podcast, says, "When we talk about what we're up to, Marcia invariably runs down a staggering, dizzying, ever-expanding list of projects she's involved with. Sometimes I gently suggest that she shouldn't add more to her plate, and she agrees, but invariably she takes the work on anyway, because she can't say no to this one important project or lovely writer or wonderful book that deserves attention. There is so much to admire in what you've built, and many of us are deeply in your debt. But I think what strikes me most is that you've created this indispensable structure, and yet it doesn't feel like an institution. It feels like a home, one with many doors, a table where more seats can always be found. The ArabLit website describes itself as a crowd-funded collective, and I think I've seen it described elsewhere as a publishing cooperative. It would have been easy as the project grew to take on the logic of an institution, to be more guarded, more careful. But you're not made like that, thank God. To quote a writer we both love, Jean Rhys, "Oh dear, the middle way respectable ones, they can be the devil." ArabLit is now a team of people, but it is the way it is because of what you are like, Marcia. An open heart and a skeptical mind, always kind and at the same time wonderfully fierce and persistent in speaking out against prejudice or ignorance or injustice. I happen to know that you have a special love for speculative fiction, fiction that presents us with other worlds, and that you also have a particular interest in literature for younger readers, an area you described as being huge, wild, fun, funny, and innovative. Clearly you're drawn to what might be, what we haven't yet invented, but might still be able to imagine. And it's this curiosity about how else we might live that animates everything we do. Among the many volumes you've translated from Arabic is a book of fantastical stories by Sonia Nimr called Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands, which won the Palestine Book Award in 2022. Set hundreds of years ago, it follows the adventures of a young woman called Qamar, or Moon, from a mountain in Palestine across deserts and seas, telling tales all the while to survive. There's a section in the book that takes place in Gaza, when Qamar glimpses the sea for the first time. In late October of last year, Marcia, you wrote, "Every time I think of Gaza, I also think of Qamar's journey there, how it was a place of respite and beauty, how it could be a place of respite and beauty." For those of us who make our lives in and around Arabic, and of course for many others, the last 8 months have been excruciating. I know I'm not alone in having doubted what literature can do when the very conditions of life are being annihilated. ArabLit has always been a space of celebration, indeed, a place of respite and beauty. And in the last 8 months, it has also become a space to grieve, to record, and to remember. The latest issue of ArabLit Quarterly, the beautiful magazine you've been publishing for 6 years now, is devoted to Gaza. It was co-edited with Mohammed Zabzouk and Mahmoud al-Sha'ir, who I believe are both in Gaza now. In this issue they write, We share poems, testimonies, articles, and reflections on the ongoing war, hoping that these texts and experiences create an opportunity, however small, for survival, because we believe that every attempt at expression is an attempt to survive. Dear Marcia, we've yet to meet, but by the time I speak these words to you, we will have met. What a strange and fantastical technology writing is, that it allows us to speak across time in this way. If I know anything about you, it is your belief, a belief I passionately share, that it is possible to speak to each other across all kinds of distance. That what matters is not where you come from, but where you stand, and what you do, and who you choose to love. The news that you've been granted this award was met with an outpouring of joy and excitement and support around the world. The reaction that pleased me most was also the briefest, 2 words, by the poet Fadi Jouda, who simply said, "Love wins." Congratulations, Marcia, and thank you for everything.
I actually think that we should end the event now. I can't follow Yasmine, but and my remarks seem so paltry now in comparison. The loveliest thing anyone has ever said about me or ever could, really. So I'm gonna scratch that first part. Although, thank you so much to Yasmine, who I think is one of the great superstars of our field, and who herself has managed to bring, through her talent and finesse, so many new readers for new reasons into Arabic literature and translation. And thank you, of course, to Words Without Borders, which is one of the few, I think, broad-based literary institutions in the US that has remained light in spirit, not fixed in place, but listening to its authors, its translators, its educators, and its readers. And I do want to come back to that, but as I give this talk, I want to first of all remember my colleagues, and Haya, as well as all the writers we published together this spring, and their families, and their friends, and their neighbors all across Gaza. May you all be safe. And I also hope that those of you in the audience, both now and later, will bear with me as I try to feel my way forward in this era, for which I do not have the language in which we watch genocidal horrors on our computers and on our phone screens day after day, and yet struggle to find mechanisms to stop them. And of course, individual choice, which is the gilded promise of our era, gives us almost no leverage, and it's easy to throw up our hands and say we cannot personally affect the systems around us. But we as writers, as translators, as editors, and as publishers are not just individuals, but also a community that can shape words, to shape ideas, and then occasionally see these ideas reshape our reality. So in this period of accelerated extraction and restriction, where stories can travel while storytellers often cannot, I want to take a moment to reflect not on the literature that reaches us through translation, but on the processes by which it does. In the last 15 years that I have been, and people do remind me that I started reading your blog when I was still a kid, when I was in college. It's been a long time that I've been producing this small literary project called ArabLit. I have observed that there is an approach to the literature of other languages and countries, and I'm speaking particularly about those pairings in which there is a peri-colonial or other extractive relationship that sees literature as a resource, whereby the publisher goes to that other market with a bit of condescension, with their pickaxe or their explosives, their scouts and their freelance translators, and looks to mine what they can of a literature in order to repackage and sell it in their own market. Now, yes, of course, more often publishers will not go there at all, but will, as during and after the US-led invasion and occupation of Iraq, publish literature, for instance, by US soldiers that promises to allow the reader to travel without unsettling their sense of self in any way. Generally, translation is seen as the hero here, the force of unsettling, and is sometimes called a bridge between cultures, something many translators and thinkers have already problematized, Mona Karim, Mona Bakers, and two others. And while I certainly would recommend that you read widely among Iraqi writers, for one thing, they've been producing literature for more than 1,000 years. And while I would love to see more of it available in English translation, I would not suggest that translation is, in itself, necessarily a force for good. And if we do see a bridge of translation, it is often the same kind of bridge that exists in other spheres, where tanks and banned weapons and Hollywood blockbusters cross the bridge into Iraq, while only a few Iraqi stories, under very particular conditions, make it into the US. After all, translation is not exempt from the real-world conditions in which we find ourselves, and publishers, including sometimes small publishers, will, in the process of taking literature from its context and repackaging it in a way that makes sense for the local consumer, cover it in plastic, put a woman in niqab with kohl-rimmed eyes on the cover, remove a chapter, add a chapter, sell it in a 2-for-1 deal with literature by US soldiers, whatever makes sense in the local market. And sometimes publishers will feel virtuous for having done so. Naturally, writers in a world of great imbalances often want to be recognized in translation, particularly in languages that have more resources, where this means wider recognition, being better paid, getting invitations to international festivals and residencies. But translation here is not a virtue, but a means of access. Meanwhile, sometimes bookworkers in languages with better resources will consider the act of translation such a good as to give no real consideration to how it is done. So I want to think a little about the how, particularly when a place is at the center of a news and attention cycle. And one example that doesn't involve English is the way Syrian literature had a boom in Germany, largely in translation. In 2020, Marie Ottaway did a special section for ArabLit on what she called the miniature boom of Syrian literature in Berlin, and I urge you all to read the interviews she conducted. Since ArabLit doesn't have the greatest search capabilities, I reposted it at arablit.org/boom. So in this boom, there was a particular kind of literature that was being solicited and cultivated, and a community of Syrian writers, at least in Europe, that was affected by this. And I'll quote just a couple of writers and artists who Mari interviewed while noting that here they're referring not just to publishers, but event curators, magazine editors, interviewers, and so on. The poet and writer Rami al-Ashaq told her that people say, show us how much you are suffering on the way to Europe and how much Europe is good. And the writer and philosopher Yasmine Saleh talked with Mari about how his story was repackaged to be consumable by an audience hungry for these sexy stories of suffering. And this applies not just to Syrian literature and German translation, but to other times and places where literary translation was mobilized to comfort the comfortable, underlining a superiority narrative. You can find examples in how some Global South to Global North immigration narratives are packaged, or in the Saving Muslim Women genre, to borrow terminology from Laila al-Award. But back to Syrian literature in Germany, I do think if we transport ourselves back in time to 2020, there were several ways this could have gone. Yasmina Jaisati, the core literary agent who's worked with Arabic literature and translation, and who somehow manages to keep an optimistic outlook, thought that this initial opening might ultimately create more space for Syrian literature in German long term. As readers discovered great short story stylists like Rasha Abbas, novel craft like that of the late and beloved Khalid Khalifa, the poetry of Julan Haji, and much, much more. However, if we skip ahead from 2020 to the fall of 2023, when the news cycle has changed, when there are increasing and sometimes violent demands on Arab writers who were once welcomed by German readers to prove that they will not be critical of the Israeli state, when Adania Shibli and other Palestinian and Arab writers are being slandered in the newspapers, and when German publishers are afraid to stand up for even the most basic right to speech, when Syrian-Palestinian author Riyad al-Madhoun, who lives in Berlin, says that while previously he would have been invited to dozens of events to mark the release of a new book in translation, with his latest there have been virtually none. So this development was very fast, from the extractive to shutting down, from profiting off the writing of the community not necessarily monetarily, but also in the sort of esteem of the reader, to abandoning a community. I also imagine that this picture of literary translation will be unfamiliar to some translators. In some language pairings, there is a more equal relationship and often a multi-way dialogue. And I'm in no way suggesting that there should not be repackaging or some forms of adaptation, or that there is or should be any agreement about what good literature is from language to language and culture to culture. The French absolutely have the right to believe that Ayn Rand or Thomas Friedman is a misunderstood genius. But the key here is that in these language pairings where there's a more equal relationship, as well as an ongoing emotional and material investment in both directions, writers often get more control over how they're presented, and publishers and others are not coming in to strip a landscape bare, then abandon it as the attention cycle moves relentlessly on. Now, the literature currently in the spotlight in many languages is Palestinian. If we set aside literary institutions for a moment, much of the individual and community attention on Palestinian literature is in the deepest solidarity, or so I believe, and the sharing of poetry by Rafat al-Arir, Musa Abu Toha, Abu Nada, and others, the little libraries at the student encampments, the free books on Palestine offered by publishers like Haymarket, Interlink, Saki, Kama, Between the Lines. And I do believe that literature can create shared spaces and new understandings. But also some of the attention to Palestinian literature is opportunistic. There's both the republication of older Palestinian poems in order to deflect what literary institutions are now doing as they remain silent or obscure violence, sometimes on the behalf of donors. And there is also the making of money. I cannot speak for other publishers, but our only short story collection, which I think is now gone, was by Palestinian author Samira Azam and was translated by the wonderful Rania Abdurrahman with a foreword by Adania Shibli, who is such a champion of Samira's work. The book was published at the end of 2022, and thanks to Adania and our small community, it did receive some attention in 2022 and the first half of 2023. But then it received extraordinary, unexpected attention in late 2023 and 2024, and I think we have now sold more than 5,000 copies of a short story collection by a long-deceased writer in translation. We published this book because we thought that economic success with it was impossible, and thus that no other publisher would be interested. Otherwise, we would have suggested this project to a larger publisher. And when I checked last week, our most popular issue of the magazine was still our Cats issue. This is the first time bookshops around the world have been reaching out to us, asking to stock our Gaza issue. And I imagine we will ultimately sell more copies of this issue than any other. And I will add that all profits from this issue go to our partners at Majalla 28 in Gaza. But obviously other publishers have noticed this sort of interest, including larger publishers, some of whom have reached out to us. In a recent Zoom call with one publisher who asked for recommendations of Palestinian literature, I was told, we don't want to capitalize on what's happening. I do believe this editor was being self-reflective, but with the recognition that one might indeed capitalize on the current attention cycle. Yet unlike in Germany, where we documented one part of the story, interest, happening in 2020, and another, vilification, happening in 2023 and 2024, here in English they're happening at the same time, and there are publishing houses that are simultaneously interested in and afraid of Palestinian literature. I say all of this not from a position of someone who has solved any of these questions of how to support literature without opportunistically benefiting, but only as someone attempting to find the words to describe the landscape around us. I also don't believe any of these things must happen, or that any of these relationships need to be extracted. So I do want to also highlight some initiatives that I believe are more multi-directionally sustainable, beginning with one in Germany. The organization called 1011, named for the uprisings of 2010 and 2011, run by Catherine Holes and Sandra Hetzel. 1011 is not just a cooperative effort in which the ongoing interests and needs of writers matter when promoting their writing and translation to German and to other languages, but the staff of 1011 are also proponents of their own writers and translators making a living. Yasmina Joyce's Raya agency, of course, has been a relentless champion of the rights of Arab authors for 2 decades, and Ruth Ahmed Zai's Azulejos. I also note that when I refer to extraction and profiting, I don't mean only among for-profit publishing activities. Non-profit bodies can also be extractive, demanding literature of a certain sort to show their donors so that they can prove that they're achieving particular outcomes. Instead of supporting a local literary community, for instance, they might end up supporting only particular narratives, a certain frame on women's rights, a certain kind of freedom of speech, while closing out other possibilities. And one of the things I admire about Words Without Borders, and there are many, is that while they certainly have shared values, I don't see them as trying to impose a definition of what a world literature should be. As I have seen it, they don't enter a country or a language with a preset idea of what they want to showcase, such as liberating women narratives or suffering women narratives. But instead, they listen to local writers, to translation communities, and to bicultural translators. I want to finish by recalling a thread that translator-author Anton Hur shared on Twitter, in which he talked about the failures of some big literary institutions, some of which have met this moment with cowardly marketing language at best and genocide apologia at worst, suggesting that literary institutions, and this is Anton, suggesting that literary institutions should be more cloud-like, that literary weight should not settle into giant buildings fixed in place, but that they should be able to move, to change shape, to change with writers and literary movements instead of trying to fix them in place. And there is sometimes a lamenting of the closure of small literary magazines. But as Anton notes, clouds move and reform, come together and separate. ArabLit has hung around in the stratosphere for a long time now. Some would say too long, largely because it doesn't have much heft. And I look forward to the day that it breaks up and reforms into new and interesting projects, and most especially to how it might feed new communities that can write and translate a more just and generous world. And thank you for bearing with me for that.
Thank you so much, Yasmine. Thank you, Marcia. And that concludes the speaking portion of our program. You are now free to continue speaking in a more casual setting.